feminism is a tough topic for me, and mostly because it is so grounded in this notion of there being men and women, and those women having children. The very notion of the notion that that somehow purports a kind of freedom, I think is slightly flawed. I think when it comes to if we are conflating feminism with gender, and effectively suggesting that there is some gender equality and what that means in the built environment, I would argue two things. The first thing I would argue is that when you make things affordable, things easily become easier. And so there is that initial question about the economy and how that purports to support everybody. But then secondly, there is this question of what feminism means in relation to certainly the community that I'm here to talk about. And well, you know, I'm going to talk about everybody, but in this instance, what stands out to me is gender as it applies to what it means to be gendered today. And certainly in that context, what looks like a feminist city, if we are looking at that in relation to gender, is what a city looks like when it is safe for people who do not have access to the tools of safety. And it's as much about baby carriages and lit laneways, and it's as much about all of that as it is about how we define gender in and of itself, and what it means to be equal in what it means to have access in the context of the urban built environment. So I would ask us to really question how it is we look at sort of even postmodern conceptions of feminism in that context. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is, for me, what a feminist city looked like was when I was in Dubai. And it is fascinating, how when we talk about the tools of what it means to create access and what it means to create visibility, we rarely talk about that in the cultural context. So Kofi's example of the Regent Park swimming pool is a perfect one, actually, because I was just reading something about this very recently. And it's great that they have screens, and those screens can, when there's play, when there's sort of free time and they're specific to Muslim women. Unfortunately, Muslim women can't access that service unless it's free time. It happens to be drop-in. And so that creates its own barriers. And we know that the people who access the pool particularly are people who have access to resources, because they are the ones that are able to get up at 6 in the morning. They are the ones online. They are the ones able to make sure, and I know I'm one of them, we are the ones able to make sure that, we have Wi-Fi, all of those things that I have access to create access to the thing. And so I don't know how we talk about one without the other, but also I also know that certainly for me, in the environment I grew up in, what was considered feminist, I suppose, in that sense, separate was equal. So if women had their own spaces, then the way they defined those spaces was what made them empowering, and the fact that they could define those spaces for themselves. Often, in relation to kind of institutional culture, we know that it is more than having more women architects, having more women in construction, having more women in those positions of senior leadership, because it is the actual culture, it's the rules that create the construct, not the people in them. That is kind of, the whole notion of institutional culture, service culture as it applies to different areas, applies to this so acutely, precisely because it is unable almost to engage with a conversation that is beyond the kind of barriers that we create. And in this case, you can imagine, if we're talking about, let's say, what it means to not be man or woman, not identify yourself as man or woman, not necessarily for whom the ways in which you access freedom in the built environment, you don't have children. What does that mean to you? And I think that sort of our public discourse needs to start to engage much more with the kind of gray areas in between, because we know that when we deal with the gray areas in between, we're dealing with the most marginalized, right? Because they tend to be the most invisible.